For fans who are starved and desperate for more college football action, the spring game provides them an outlet and an opportunity to see their team and get excited for the upcoming season. Typically around this time of the year, we start to see teams have glorified scrimmages, which are on TV, fans can attend and have an opportunity to interact with the players. For me personally, I always liked watching the spring game just to see all the new faces, especially the freshmen and the transfers, and just to sort of get that football buzz. Except now, for some sort of weird dumb reason, teams are canceling spring games. They're trying to take more of an NFL approach, whatever the heck that means, so you will not be able to see your beloved scrimmage this upcoming spring and in future years. But in today's video, we're going to dive into it all. We're going to talk about how spring games became such a big part of college football culture, and then ultimately why it's starting to fall off and why teams are canceling the beloved games. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you can support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about spring games. Okay, so going back in time, football is a fall and winter sport, but even as far back in the late 1880s, some coaches have seen the good that practicing in the spring can do for their programs. The first spring practices were said to have been done at Harvard at the request of their captain. And since Harvard was one of the best programs in college football at the time, other schools started copying them to hopefully get as good as the Crimson. They started out as basic fundamentals camps, focusing on things like kicking, tackling, and carrying the ball. But before too long after that, it became common practice for teams to play each other in the spring in meaningless scrimmages used as practice opportunities. Some teams even started their forays into college football with spring games. Some historians say that Oregon's first official football game took place against another college in March of 1894, which was Albany College. This eventually turned into the first quote-unquote spring game in 1925. Michigan was fresh off of a 6-2 season and had placed fourth in the Big Ten Conference behind Iowa, Illinois, and Chicago. Michigan fans were eager to see the team get over the hump, and Michigan was also eager to capitalize on the fans' interest. So they ended up setting up the first ever inter-squad spring game, letting fans in to watch the team play each other. It slowly started to gain a lot of traction throughout the country, to the point where just about every major program was having a spring game, which was now open to the public by the 1950s. Regional powers such as Ohio State and Nebraska held their first spring games in 1946 and 1950 respectively. But since it was outside the realm of normal football activities, the NCAA originally didn't have much oversight on spring football itself. It wasn't until the 90s that spring practices started to get standardized across the country to protect the health of all of its players. Coaches like Bear Bryant were famous for working their players harder over the spring than during the actual season, using full pads for practices and sometimes even restricting water for the players, which caused some problems specifically in the South. But the tough practices would pay off, especially for Bryant and his teams at Kentucky, Texas A&M, and Alabama, which all came in the 1960s and onward. Nebraska used the extra spring practices to innovate by hiring the sport's first strength coach, which came in 1969, kickstarting their dynasty as one of the greatest teams in Midwestern college football history. The NCAA stepped in before the 1988 season to reduce the number of practices, and for the spring game, reduce the amount of practices a player could be in pads for. If teams wanted to have a spring matchup, they'd have to count it towards their padded practices. These games would end up peaking in the 1990s as interest in college football was on the upswing, and it never stopped from there. Athletic departments noticed that the spring game was a way for fans to stay invested in the program, even while months away from the actual season, and of course they took advantage of it. Coaches recognized that these spring matchups were great opportunities to mess around with potential plays and get creative with the playbook to see what actually sticks. Players also always loved the extra chance to prove themselves to their coaches, especially players who are on the border between starters and bench warmers. The media and press started to focus heavily on these games because it could get them information on great players before they ended up breaking out during the regular season. There have been many instances of players breaking out in spring games, and even today, journalists follow them. Games like Georgia, Miami, and Michigan get a ton of looks, and the Alabama game is always one of the top events. This is also an opportunity to see new quarterbacks, which everybody loves, and while it means absolutely nothing, people love to talk about it, including myself on the channel. In order to change it up, some teams even started to make changes to the way the game was played, like switching the score of the teams at halftime or making things like a third down stop worth 5 points. One of the most memorable changes came in Nebraska's spring game in 2013, where a young cancer patient by the name of Jack Hoffman actually ran for a touchdown. Sadly, he passed away. Back when Steve Spurrier was the head coach of the Gamecocks, he'd often have a random person come off the bench to score a touchdown in the spring game, and in 2014, it was women's basketball coach Dawn Staley. In 2018, long after his retirement, it was actually Spurrier himself. These matchups stayed as a form of innovation for a while, with one of the schools at the forefront being the UCF Knights. UCF has done a handful of fun things during their spring games over the past few years, as in 2024 they had the Knights versus the Knots game, which was complete with alternate uniforms. They brought back their old fan favorite nickname of the Citronauts for one team to wear during the game, and on top of that, they also had kids draw straws on logos they'd use for helmet decals. In 2022, they went weird and had a QR code leading to a player's social media account, and the year before that, their nameplates had their social media account names instead of their last names. Both of these stunts were pulled for attention and to help out with NIL. In 2024, almost 80,000 people showed up for Ohio State's spring game, and that wasn't anywhere near the numbers they've had in the past, with over 100,000 in 2016, and 99,000 in 2015, and 95,000 in 2009. Texas drew 40,000 to DKR for their spring game last year, and Nebraska had over 60,000 people. Other teams like Texas A&M and Florida State also have a rich history with large crowds showing up for these awesome spring matchups. So, what is the issue here? Honestly, there should be nothing. It's great for the fans, it's good for the players, it gets people in the mood for college football, and it's a fun activity to do as things are starting to warm up outside. Now we're seeing a lot of teams cancel their spring game, and the beloved tradition might be on its way out. So why on earth is that happening? Over the years though, spring games have started to go away for different reasons. Some coaches have never liked them to begin with, like Kansas State's Chris Kleiman, who has never had a spring game while head coach of K-State. Jeff Choate at Nevada is on record saying, quote, "I hate spring football. You're either going to make somebody mad because they didn't get enough reps, or you're going to get somebody hurt, which is even worse. I just don't see the value in it anymore." Some coaches also think it's a waste of time and would rather use the padded practice day on a normal padded practice. The largest of the other reasons that has achieved a lot of press is the transfer portal though. One of the more outspoken coaches in this regard is Texas's Steve Sarkisian, as during the college football playoff, he took issue with the timeline set for declarations into the portal. He said, quote, "More of the concern is how to practice. I think this is one of the unintended consequences of having the portal while the playoffs are occurring, because now we're having to get guys to prepare to play in a game, but also to service the offense to get them ready to play in the game. I don't think that's what we intended to do when we opened up the portal the way that we did." Then, just a week ago in the time of writing the script for this video, he told the press at Texas that, quote, "They weren't going to be having their spring game this year because we've got a lot of young players on our roster. We have 21 mid-year high school kids who just showed up. The development that is needed to get these guys ready for the fall is a little bit different than it used to be." But reading between the lines here, there's a lot of people that think the real reason that Texas isn't having a spring game is because some of these teams might see how good some of these young guys are. Some of them might then be enticed to go into the transfer portal and join their team instead, because of all the unregulation with this stuff. Matt Rule was the first coach to officially sound the alarm on it when he told the press why he wasn't having one, as Rule would say, quote, "It's just an absolute free open common market. I don't necessarily want to open up the outside world and have people watch our guys and say, quote, 'He looks like a pretty good player, let's go get him.' Then to go out and bring a bunch of new players and showcase them for all the other schools to watch doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I can't remember any actual times when a team was able to get someone out of the portal after a spring game, but I guess technically the threat is still there. But that's probably why a handful of coaches are finally getting rid of these games, and even coaches that are still doing the games feel like it's a problem. Billy Napier at Florida said, quote, "I'm either going to have coaches tampering with my players, or I'm going to have a fan base that's mad when we don't have a spring game. Pick your poison." Ohio State has announced they're getting rid of their spring game in favor of some sort of fan event. Lane Kiffin famously turned his spring game into more of a celebration of the upcoming season with the Grove Bowl games. Players play tug of war, have eating contests, and do a little bit of 7-on-7. BYU held an alumni game instead of a spring game since 2016. USC and head coach Lincoln Riley still haven't made up their minds on where they want to go as a program, but it isn't looking good. Florida State won't hold a spring game because of renovations to Doak Campbell Stadium, but the general consensus is that's an excuse not to hold one. UCF won't do anything for fun for their spring game this year because they aren't having one. Some people proposed using the spring to have bowl games, mostly in reference to complete overhauls in the college football schedule, but proposals like this are really huge and would require massive changes to the way college football is set up. Most schools have just stopped playing spring games altogether, and as of right now, only about half of the schools in college football even still have them. One of the main pushes for having spring games in the 2000s was that teams could find new ways to connect with their fan base before the season started. Spring games were the best ways to get fans excited for a dark horse player that might have been a surprise, or they may not have known about before the year. But now, because of social media and the amount of attention they get, this really means the players aren't much of a secret anymore. But it doesn't mean the spring game is totally dead. Some coaches are still really fond of it, as Willie Fritz at Houston said, quote, "It allows you to see what you've got and what guys can do and what they can't do. You get into technique and fundamentals, and you get to work with everybody. If you got 100 guys out there, maybe the 100th guy gets almost as many reps as the first guy." John Summerall at Tulane said, quote, "I don't have the luxury of going out and buying everybody else's players because my NIL situation doesn't allow that, so I have to develop them." There are a handful of coaches that still think the spring game has some value, and that's something to keep an eye on moving forward, but mostly with the rise of social media and especially the transfer portal and the wild west that has to do with it, the death of these beloved games seems imminent, and unfortunately, they probably won't be around for much longer. Honestly, if your team has one this upcoming spring, you might as well go ahead and buy a ticket and get over there, because it may never happen again. For now though, we'll just have to wait and see. But what do you guys think? Do you think spring games are important? Do you think they're meaningless? And why do you think they're going away? If not, what do you think a substitute for them should be? And before you go, don't forget to also leave a like if you support today's video. Let me know what topic I should do next, and check out my other videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.